feels quite appropriate that our first panel is on climate reporting and adaptation. Thank you all for joining me. I'll get you to introduce yourselves when I've asked the first question, if that's okay. So I think it's fair to say we've seen leaps forward in terms of climate reporting. TCFD rolled out in the UK, other countries following suit. We've also seen the first proposals around the sustainable disclosure requirements for the ISSB, which was only announced, the creation of which was only announced at COP26 in November last year. So what would you like to see when you're speaking to companies through your investing or clients? What would you like to see in terms of climate reporting and disclosure? Paul, I'll start with you first, if that's okay. If you could introduce yourself first, that would be great.
Hi everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Paul Udall. I'm a portfolio manager at Lombard Odier. I manage the Climate Transition Fund at Lombard Odier, and I've been managing climate strategies for the last 15 years. So it's a very good question. We spend a lot of time within our team meeting with companies, particularly engaging with them on net zero, and trying to encourage but also get better data from them so we can track their progress. I think the key things for us are there's been a lot of new disclosures, particularly around carbon emissions. The piece of work we're doing at the moment is around Scope 3 emissions and supply chain reporting. So we still find that the data is pretty poor when it comes to companies understanding their Scope 3 emissions, but also understanding the impact that they have on the economy and particularly their supply chain. So that's sort of ongoing work. The other point I'd probably make is for certain sectors, I think the data is fairly good, but there are lots of other sectors that have been quite slow to kind of come understand the importance of this data. And I think financial services is probably one that could do with a lot of improvement, particularly banks, financial institutions, not only on the risk side, but also the impact they can have through better alignment with net zero.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that as an industry, that we are obsessed with data, aren't we? That we're one of those that are behind. Nachu, I wanted to ask you briefly introduce yourself and what do you look for in terms of climate reporting?
Yes, good afternoon everybody. My name is Nachu Chockalingam. I'm a portfolio manager at Federated Hermes. I work on the credit team and I manage two different sustainable credit strategies, one of which is a climate change high yield strategy. Very similar to Paul, there's a plethora of data out there. We analyse as much of it as we can that we think makes sense, but we also acknowledge there is huge dispersion amongst a lot of the data that is out there. So we prioritise engagement as a key tool to use in terms of assessing the quality of the data that the companies are producing and the plans that they intend to put in place to help them on the transition pathway. We do value SBTIs quite heavily. The SBTI initiative put out a report in 2020 which said that companies that have SBTIs will decarbonise generally at a much faster rate than those that don't. I think the figures were roughly they will decarbonise at 6.4% per annum versus those that don't. So it enabled them to more easily achieve sort of the 1.5 degree scenario. The other things we look for when we're assessing company financial data is how much OPEX and CAPEX are they investing in climate transition pathways, and also thinking about their energy mix. If they are, if they're still sourcing a decent amount of energy from fossil fuels, how do they intend to phase that out? What are they doing in terms of increasing their renewable usage? So it's more granular company data as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And Stephanie, you're coming at this from a slightly different angle with your work on Climate Action 100. What you're working with companies on climate reporting and disclosure, what are the key things that you're looking for or talking to them about?
Great. So yes, I'm very happy to be here. So Stephanie Maier, Global Head of Sustainable Impact Investment at GAM Investments, so as an asset manager ourselves, but I also sit on the steering committee of Climate Action 100+, which is one of the largest investor engagement initiatives on climate change. So I think from from our own perspective, I think a lot of the sort of focus areas for disclosure have been well covered. I think one of the things we also look at is perhaps some of the more qualitative and forward-looking elements as well. So, the important to kind of look at the governance, the strategy, and what are actually those data points that help you understand where that company is and where it is likely to be in the future. So the Climate Action 100 Plus released its second annual benchmark in March, so earlier this year. What we can see there is that, in general, the 160 or so focus companies, so these are, largest greenhouse gas emitters, have made strong progress on, having a board member responsible, disclosing actually in line with TCFD, more broadly, and over 70% have actually made that 2050 net zero commitment. But what we're not seeing is the detail, as you mentioned, the sort of the capex. How well is that plan aligned? How are they going to achieve it? What are some of those interim targets? As well. So great 2050, but what are the 2030, 2040 targets? And the question about scope comes up a lot because, again, what part of that business is in its obviously direct control, but how are they going to look at, the risks associated with scope 3, when they're in the supply chain, yes, but also when they're in, when they're in the product mix as well. And so seeing this as a much broader sort of transition piece, we need to look at that that kind of more holistic and sometimes, qualitative as well as the quantitative data and disclosure mix as well.
Fantastic. And Tom, coming this as someone who buys and selects funds, are you getting that data that you need or disclosure from the fund managers that you're having conversations with?
Hi everyone, I'm Tom Caddick, Head of Investments at NedGroup Investments. And yeah, no, it is interesting. I mean, we don't, I don't purport to be an expert in sustainable investing. I think we're on this as part of a journey, which I'm sure everyone in this room is feeling at the moment. And when we're looking and we're asking that very question of some of the managers that we look to potentially invest in, it's trying to understand a number of things. Number one, do they understand the pathway that they need to be on? Because when we're looking at it at a portfolio level, fundamentally when it's just data driven, it is just a spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet can change the next day. The portfolio can be turned over and it can look great from a data perspective the next day when it might screen poorly today. So from our perspective, it's to understand the pathway that they're on, the resource that they've got behind it, their own use of data and whether that's proprietary or secondary, and how that fits with our values as well and what we're looking to invest with.
Okay, fantastic. And I wanted to take a bit of a look at net zero reporting. So that was a big theme last year in the lead up to COP26. We had lots of companies announcing net zero commitments. But I think what we need to understand, and you mentioned a bit about science-based targets, but is what are companies doing right now? There's all well and good committing to net zero 20, 40, 50, 60, 70. But what are the approaches that people are taking now? I mean, Stephanie, maybe you could talk a bit about some of the challenges that are going with setting these net zero targets and how these companies can report on them.
Yeah, so it's certainly an area that we're encouraging a lot more disclosure around, but fundamentally, disclosure is the end point. It's actually the target setting, and what we're seeing in the engagement with companies is very much, well, to be able to disclose the target, they need to work through, what is that pathway. So it's fine, the 2050 target can be an aspirational one. When you start having nearer term targets, it's actually understanding, how quickly that business can move, what investment is required internally to redirect and to deliver on that decarbonisation. And, these are really strategic questions, for businesses. You're looking at in some cases quite fundamental, shifts in that, in what the sector outlook is and boards questioning their business model, their operating environment in quite a lot of detail. So yes, methodologies help, like SBTi. There are challenges when you're looking at sector decarbonisation pathways because yes, what it means broadly for a sector, but what does it mean for you as a company in your operating environment? What are you able to do? How are you set up in terms of where you're operating within that sector value stream, for example? So I think what we're seeing is a phase where we're going very much from the high level commitment, intent, ambition to actually what is the detail and how we're going to get there, and that necessarily makes it a lot more nuanced and detailed and to a certain extent less comparable. And I think that's also what we're seeing. You know, some of those data, you know, the targets that we're seeing being disclosed have different, you know, different scopes in terms of 1, 2 and 3, different proportions of the business, different parts of the business. So I think it's very much something that you need to look at that detail. And despite a lot of or increasing standardisation, there's still quite a lot of disparity between the strength, the scope of the targets that we're seeing.
And Paul, you must speak to lots of different companies. Is that something that you're experiencing as well, these differing levels of integration? And
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing that we're looking for when we invest in companies is that at a senior management level, you know, they've embedded net zero in the overall kind of corporate strategy rather than just seeing it as some sort of reporting initiative. So we're looking to see how companies are adapting to this challenge and whether they're turning it into a business opportunity. And I think that's quite important because, you know, effectively we need to see a complete reformatting of the industrial economy. And so the changes are enormous. But for many companies, we can't really see a huge amount of change happening. And there's a lot of kind of defensive positioning or even possibly greenwashing going on. And to try to cut through that, we're looking from a kind of at a top level, a serious understanding that this is a critical enabler of the business growth in the future.
Yeah, it's disappointing to hear that you're seeing some of that going on. Hopefully that will change pretty soon. As I think that lots of investors are not sort of accepting this anymore, like we've been talking about. They want to see the evidence, and they will be cracking down on that. Nachu, what's your stance on net zero reporting and the conversations that you're having with corporates about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pressure on companies to disclose more data, and as Stephanie said, interim targets which we can monitor and assess, I think is only growing. I think there's been a meaningful change over the past 2 years or so. And just from the credit markets where I sit, you know, there's this huge new market that has come almost out of nowhere in the past 5 to 10 years of sustainable fixed income. If companies want to have access to green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, social bonds, they need to be in a position where they can communicate a strategy that investors will buy into. And I think that is changing. Europe is very much more ahead of the curve than the US, and the US is ahead of the curve versus emerging markets. But we are seeing this wave of momentum start to shift.
Yeah, hopefully that continues. And Tom, what about your clients? Are they asking about fund managers and their net zero commitments?
Yeah, absolutely. We're finding increasingly that our clients are wanting to understand not only the broad portfolio that they have exposure to within the markets, but what that means in terms of and how that links to any sustainable or sustainability goals, and ultimately the underlying investments and what ethos will drive those businesses that we're invested through. And it is increasingly sort of permeating those discussions that we're having at a client level.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, I wanted to move on to climate adaptation now. This was a bit of a buzzword following the last IPCC report, but it was described as the forgotten topic or something that was put in the too hard basket. But we're seeing the paper also provided scientific evidence on adaptation. There's now a sense of urgency around adaptation finance. But the current level of commitments are described as a drop in the ocean. So we can say there's a bit of a mismatch here. So I wanted to ask all of you about your interpretations of adaptation from the IPCC report. And what does that essentially mean for the financial industry? Stephanie, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. So I think when we look at climate risk, we and TCFD frames this as, you know, transition and physical risks. And I think it's important that we also focus on the physical risks. And the physical risks aren't just, you know, in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. You know, one of the things we saw from the mitigation IPCC report was, you know, we're very much seeing some of those impacts of a changing climate and increased temperatures right now. So actually there's an adaptation discussion within the companies we're investing in as well, in terms of, you know, where are they located, how robust are the supply chains, you know, how resilient are they to, you know, a number of sort of physical hazards. So I think there's certainly that adaptation piece and, you know, investment and sort of thinking through how companies are positioned already, and we're seeing that sort of, you know, transition and physical risk response come through. I think, you know, more broadly, again, what are those types of, how do we need to think about adaptation, and, particularly in the context of sort of longer-lived, infrastructure as well. We know we know we are going to see increasing climate impacts. So what does that mean, particularly for those longer-lived pieces of infrastructure? And I think, we're seeing that being much more of an issue in terms of evaluating investments up front, but we're also going to need to look at things like flood defence walls, etc. Some different physical infrastructure that will help us adapt. I think one of the other issues that I think probably hasn't been taken on board as much to date is the impact of heat, so the kind of the heat stress and what that means, because even quite marginal increases or longer periods of time at heightened temperature can mean, quite significant impacts for, technical manufacturing, as well as the impact on people.
Mm. Absolutely. And Paul, how do you consider adaptation in your portfolios or in your conversations?
Yeah, so our climate transition fund has 3 dedicated kind of strategies within it. One of them is climate solution companies, so solar and renewable energy and batteries. The other piece is the hard to abate companies and industries like steel and cement and mining, which we think are crucial because these are the ones that have most of the emissions that we need to fix. And then the final piece is adaptation. So we've identified around about 200 companies globally that have the ability to sell products and solutions to companies to help them adapt to climate change. And we think this is a crucial business opportunity as well. We think adaptation is an enormous essential business service which is going up in demand. And the reality is we are off track with net zero. So the role of adaptation grows year by year. And so businesses need to start investing now to make themselves more resilient to the impacts of climate change.
Yeah. And Nachu, when you're having conversations, how would you say businesses are splitting their time between mitigation and adaptation?
I think the focus has very much been more on mitigation. It's slowly transitioning more towards adaptation, but very similar to what Paul said. We think about it in sort of a very similar sort of context. There are various different companies in the credit universe that we call climate change innovators. They may not necessarily have big carbon footprints themselves, but essentially they are producing products and services that can be used very easily within other companies' business change to help them adapt their businesses. So we are increasingly finding more opportunities in that space. But I think the focus is changing. Companies are realizing that this is a topic that investors now want to talk more aggressively about when they meet them, and they have to have some plans in place to communicate what they intend to do. And I only think that will grow.
And Tom, is that something that you think has sort of been a growing topic in your conversations, adaptation?
Yes and no. I think mitigation has been by far the biggest discussion point from a fund management perspective. And I think that's partly down to the fact that so many groups are still relatively young into this process.
That is true.
Interestingly, adaptation has been growing as a point of discussion, particularly within some of our infrastructure strategies and broader real assets.
Okay, great. I've got a question from the audience now. In your individual assessment of companies, do you concentrate stronger on the effect of climate change on the company or of the company on climate change? Tom, I'll start with you first.
Could you say all of that again?
In your individual assessment of companies, do you concentrate stronger on the effect of climate change on the company or of the company on climate change?
Okay, yeah, that's a nice question. I mean, obviously, we're looking at it from a fund management perspective, so we're looking at it at a portfolio level. So really, I think our focus is around the engagement points that the fund management group have with the underlying. And I suppose that almost plays to sort of engagement versus avoidance from a fund management perspective. And we would always favour engagement within that. Obviously, within certain parameters, but we would favour engagement.
Great. I've got some questions for you on engagement soon. So, Paul, do you want to take that question? Do you want me to read it out again?
No, I guess I think we're particularly targeting net zero and businesses' ability to adapt and transition to net zero. So we're kind of looking at the impact that a company can have on decarbonising its operations and its business. There are obviously a whole bunch of risk factors that can impact a company from the climate perspective, and we're very cautious of that. I mean, a good example would be the insurance sector, which is potentially underpricing the risks of climate change on its business, and that's something that we are attuned to, and it makes us worry about the long-term kind of outlook for that industry. If we see more and more natural disasters, fires and floods, etc., how is that business going to adapt to this? So it's something that we do worry about. But I'd say more the former.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on because we have got quite a few more questions to get through. So, as Tom mentioned there, another big debate we have seen over the past few years is active engagement versus divestment. I think climate activists would like to see us all completely divest from fossil fuels, and there is a sense of urgency around that, but this could also be quite damaging, especially on sort of local communities. And we need to be taking those biggest polluters with us on that net zero journey. We need to be all moving along together and engage with them to be a part of that. I wanted to ask all of you what your stance is, and what are you asking either fund managers or the companies that you're dealing with? What are you asking them, and how are you asking them around their transition? So Stephanie, I'll come with you first.
Sure. So I mean, I think, the focus is very much on engagement. However, one of the things that's tied to that is what's the escalation of that engagement. So great, here are the asks. Is the company responding? So continue to be, happy to be invested. If they're not responding, how does that then, how do you escalate as an investor? And so, that brings into play, the sort of voting decisions where it's, equity. Obviously we've seen a number of shareholder resolutions, but it's not just that. It's, our voting policy looks at, holding individual directors responsible if we think they are, not addressing a, systemic, an important risk for them as a company. So voting, can be broader than just, on shareholder resolutions, things like, where it may be appropriate to have remuneration linked to specific decarbonisation. You have the remuneration vote as well. Obviously there's escalation more broadly within the engagement, I suppose, process as well. But ultimately, where we're active investors, there's a decision to be made that if we think the company isn't transitioning, we can exit that position. And so it's part of that's journey. It's one of the elements, but I think that's different from Xing out entire industries. I'd say one area where we are seeing more of that is around thermal coal. Now it will be interesting to see what this most sort of the Ukraine situation and what that has meant for energy security, particularly in Europe, will mean around that balance of thermal coal versus other energy generation mix, which has generally been decarbonising quite strongly. But I think that's the one area where we we're seeing more sort of client interest as well around excluding essentially the worst parts. But within that, it is a transition piece. Energy generators are moving away but still have coal. So for us it's very much a sort of escalation and an active decision around that transition and whether the company is well positioned or not.
Okay, thank you. And Nachu, I wanted to, same question on, I know Federated Hermes has a big active engagement team. What do you talk to clients about in terms of if they're asking for exclusion policies and that transitional finance element?
It somewhat depends on where the client is located. There are some regions, particularly in Europe, where there has been more of a government directive around certain sectors and less involvement in those sectors. So the Nordics being one, they're very, very anti-fossil fuel investing. I'd say beyond that, most of the time in Europe, it's very much more on the transition argument. For us, we like to invest in credible transition stories. We firmly believe in engagement, but as Stephanie says, engagement cannot be used as an excuse to hold, bad companies that are regressing or not meeting what they said they were going to do. So if the engagement doesn't work out for us, we have no real other choice right now other than to sell and see if the company will then change their minds in terms of their plans and policies that they have in place.
Okay, and Tom, what are your conversations with fund managers like around engagement, and how are you holding them accountable for that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's disinvestment. I mean, that's probably the biggest tool that you've got. And it's interesting because we apply the exact same approach realistically than you would at a company level, which is, you know, we have a certain bar that we expect the underlying fund manager to meet, and we will invest with them accordingly. But we would be looking for them to have procedures in place at the level of primarily engagement driven, but to be operating their own standards of potential disinvestment if that doesn't prove to develop the sort of pathway that they'd be looking for. And we'd apply that ourselves. So we're using data. I mean, you know, we have to use data that's available to us to track the underlying fund management groups and that we're invested with. And that would be one of our points of engagement. But I think, you know, one of the cornerstones of things like SFDR is around promotion of ESG in the whole within our industry. So we should be, you know, fulfilling that brief, and we'll be looking for the underlying managers to do likewise.
Absolutely. And Paul, do you have anything to add on that sort of active engagement versus divestment in argument? How are you holding the companies you invest in accountable for the promises they made in their conversations with you?
Yeah, I think, as Tom was saying, ultimately, yeah, you do divest. I mean, we're an Article 9 fund, and I think the SFDR has been a useful kind of a way to kind of emphasise and prioritise the kind of strategic direction of a strategy. You know, we have a very active engagement programme, and ultimately we want to be able to judge companies and measure their successes. And if we feel like they're not achieving it, or they've overpromised, or under-delivered, ultimately, you know, we'll divest from them. Yeah.
Okay, great. Another question from the audience here. What can private credit investors do to pursue net zero goals when engagement with portfolio companies isn't straightforward? Nachu, I'll come to you on that one.
Sorry, private credit companies.
What can private credit investors do to pursue net zero goals when engagement with portfolio companies isn't straightforward?
So I work mainly on the public credit side, so we're dealing with companies that generally have listed equity. So we have bond investors, but also equity investors talking to them. I actually think on the private credit side, it's a slightly different approach that you would take. One thing that's been interesting is private credit typically is driven by LBOs, so companies that are bought by financial sponsors. And you would think that those objectives of those financial sponsors are quite different from an ESG-focused investor. But actually they are merging. You know, the LBO financing has changed quite materially over the past 2 years or so. We have seen instances where, you know, LBO financing has included some green component attached to it. So they're realising that there is an investor base for this that will buy it. If they have a credible plan and a credible strategy, potentially there is the ability for them to get cheaper financing. So a slightly different approach, potentially more influence because it's private credit owned company. You have very few investors to satisfy in terms of aspirations, but I think it is changing more for the positive.
Okay, fantastic. Does anyone else want to have a go at that question on the private credit side?
No.
Okay.
But I just would comment that actually I think you're seeing similar things on the private equity side.
Yeah.
Which I know is a slightly different, clearly a different market, but actually a very well sort of evolved side of ESG, given the amount of control and leverage that a private equity house has.
Okay, another question we've had is what is the one thing that you would like to see come out of COP27? Stephanie, I'll come with you first. You're closest to me.
Well, obviously, I mean, sort of the technical elements that sort of were, I suppose, in a certain sense, parked at COP26.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's not enough climate finance when it comes to, you know, so it's like, well, everyone go back to the table, come back at COP27 and bring something better. You know, we saw some ratcheting of the NDCs, the country level targets, but, you know, not to the sort of scale that was is needed if you look at, you know, what they should deliver in terms of temperature rise. So it was like there's an expectation of the ratcheting coming through at COP27. But clearly the world has, seen some pretty significant events since then. So I think for me, it's, are we going to see if not global cooperation, because I think we've seen that, I think that the recent events have shown the huge challenges there are around that. But is there still that, centre of gravity and leadership to continue to drive the decarbonisation that we need to see? And I think for me, one of the key outputs, I hope, is a very clear, I suppose, sense and evidence that is continuing. So, yes, there are some real challenges we need to deal with. Yes, energy security, yes, cost of living, but actually, how do we come up with some of those solutions that are also delivering on the imperative of net zero?
Yeah, fantastic. I think, the importance is what are we doing right now rather than considering this further down the line. Nachu, is there anything that you would like to see come out of COP27?
I think, we as investors can only do so much. So I think we are reliant on governments and regulators potentially upping the ante in terms of the speed with which they want to see companies actually transition. So possibly more further regulation or guidance around what companies actually need to do.
Okay, fantastic. Tom?
I agree with all of that. I mean, my personal view is actually there's quite a lot that we can do within finance, but it's got to be done collectively. And it's easy for one of us to sit there and say that, but it's got to be done collectively, because ultimately money, capital is the way to really push change. But I think I'd echo those views. Something tangible to come out.
I think a lot of the interviews that we've had on ESG Clarity, the CEOs of asset managers are all talking about industry collaboration. So hopefully everyone is on the same page and we can push forward together on that. What would you like to see, Paul, from COP27?
Yeah, definitely more tangible, focused targets. I guess COP26 was disappointing, and I worry that the next one, there's been so many things happened since the last one that it's going to be kind of derailed again with the war, also energy crisis, and all sorts of challenges to the kind of global economy right now. So I guess I'm really hoping that we can see more collaboration. We've also got the midterm as in the US and the impact that might have on US carbon markets. So there's a lot to go for.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Do we have any questions from the live audience rather than Slido, just before I continue? No? Okay, great. One last question for all of you. Actually, we'll bring it to a close there as we are running out of time. But we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about climate reporting, adaptation, net zero, engagement. What would be your one action point or key takeaway for the audience today to take away from this? I'll reverse it. I'll come to you first, Paul.
Well, I think that the tipping point has passed. We are seeing an enormous kind of momentum towards this wave of investment in the transition, which is fantastic. We've been kind of waiting for this for a long time. It was on the fringe of finance for many, many years. So I think even the events we've seen with COVID, the war, are all kind of adding to this kind of urgency. And my one takeaway is this is a great sign that we're starting to see some serious movement in finance.
Fantastic. Okay, Tom.
I mean, I think it really would just be sort of to echo our experience as investing in funds, which is to hold the underlying accountable, to hold their feet to the fire, and to combine data with that qualitative engagement as a means of really sort of broadening out your own understanding.
Absolutely. Very good point there. Nachu.
Yeah, slightly apt for your next panel, actually. I think you will start to see more linkage between climate issues and social issues going forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Stephanie?
I think it's about embracing the detail and the complexity. I think we know what needs to happen, we know the urgency, but we also know it's not straightforward. So actually recognise that there are going to be difficult conversations, there are going to be, judgments to be made. It's not going to be a clean maybe misusing that word, transition, it's going to be messy. So actually, get ready for that, but that's fine. We need to make these significant changes, and we all need to get engaged in understanding what that means and what that means for our investments.
Fantastic. We've got one more quick question specifically for Tom. So I'm putting you right on the spot now. As you primarily work with the data the fund managers provide to you, how do you cope with divergences in the data providers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we came to the conclusion on that we had to buy in our own data as well, so that we could have a degree of consistency. Our conclusion on that whole long 9-month beauty parade was that it's the Wild West out there at the moment in terms of data, and trying to find a consistency of data in the calculation methodology. We could see there was a number of really good groups, and who are pushing and forging ahead in this space. And it's about getting coverage and breadth of coverage. It's about shifting into coverage of both the equity and the bond space, as well as then into the more alternatives. All of the sort of questions about how to tackle portfolios that have long-short positions. So lots going on. And, I won't say who we ended up going with, but, we're spending a lot of money on data. And even then, when we ask questions, we're getting answers, which are algorithms, not answers. So it really does feel like a difficult space. But our only response to that is to use our own consistent level of data and then compare that with the level of questioning and answers that we're getting from the underlying groups.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I will end that there. Thank you for a fantastic panel. Great way